Feel the weight of the world weighing heavy on my mind. Feel the weight of the world weighing heavy on my mind.
The world's on fire, in case you haven't heard, and it's our fault. I'm going to tell you why and what we can do about it. Stick around. Might not all be depressing. Our story begins millions of years ago. Okay, well, only kind of. Back then, during what the smart folks at the Smithsonian Institute call the Pliocene epoch, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was at around 415 parts per million. Trust me, that's a lot. For some context, in the year 1600, back before the Industrial Revolution swept in and started pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the concentration was only around 274 parts per million. In 2016, the world passed the 400 parts per million barrier again. How did we get here? What happened? What are we doing about it? Our story actually begins in 1640, when a Flemish guy called Johann Baptista van Helmont figured out that air was made of gases. He figured it out by studying what he called spirit of wood, which was given off when wood burned, and, importantly, when coal burned too. This is important because in the 1600s, coal started to outpace wood as the go-to fuel, according to the American Museum of Natural History. Nowadays, we call spirit of wood carbon dioxide, CO2. When Van Helmont was doing his experiment, the concentration of carbon dioxide was around 280 parts per million. Remember that. It'll be important later. The revolution would see many important inventions, including steam boilers and the coal-driven engines that powered the trains and steamboats that connected the world through the Victorian Age. By connected the world, I do mean enabled colonialism, but I digress. By 1850, the concentration of CO2 had risen to 286 parts per million, according to the American Museum of Natural History. Around that time, in 1856, a scientist called Eunice Foote figured out that gases could trap heat by testing with water vapor and CO2. 3 years later, a guy called John Tyndall figured out that while nitrogen and oxygen, the most prominent gases in our atmosphere, really don't trap much heat at all, 3 gases trap quite a lot: ozone, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. In just over 200 years, we had all the pieces we needed to figure out that by burning coal, we were emitting CO2 and warming the atmosphere. According to the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, though, the Swede who put all the pieces together in 1896, Svante Arrhenius, thought that global warming might be a good thing. In 1900, there were fewer than 50,000 cars on the road, according to the AMNH. That year, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere hit 300 parts per million. Within 2 decades, Ford was producing 500,000 cars per year, most of which were running on oil. In 1938, a guy named Guy Callendar, not of calendar-making fame, he was an engineer, documented Earth's rising temperature for the first time, and he blamed it on carbon dioxide. Callendar estimated that the increase was around 0.005 degrees Celsius per year for the last 50 years. 20 years later, another scientist, Charles Keeling, started measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide using equipment that he designed himself. Those measurements, which have continued to this day, showed that in March of 1958, the world was at around 313 parts per million of carbon dioxide. 2 years after that, John Mercer warned us for the first time that the ice caps had melted before, and were melting again. In 1992, some years after Mercer's 1968 warning, two scientists called Smith and Bodemeyer warned of another water-based threat, the acidification of the ocean. According to UK Research and Innovation, CO2's absorption into water increases the water's acidity, putting coral, clams, oysters, and the like at risk. 3 years later, in 1995, the Larsen A ice shelf collapsed into the ocean, proving Mercer right. In 2003, another box on the apocalypse bingo card was ticked, as a massive heat wave in Europe caused upwards of 30,000 deaths, which was later linked to climate change, according to UCAR. Remember Tyndall from earlier? Well, he actually mentioned another gas in his 1859 study, methane, or as he called it, hydrocarbon vapors. On the subject, he said, quote, "An almost inappreciable admixture of any of the hydrocarbon vapors would produce great effects on the terrestrial rays and produce corresponding changes of climate." Well, scientists with NERC found that over the 2007-2008 International Polar Year, more than 250 plumes of methane gas were released from the seabed in West Spitsbergen, due, in large part, to the warming of the sea. And, as previously mentioned, we passed that 400 parts per million mark in fall of 2016. As of 2019, the United Nations estimated that around 1 million species face extinction. The same year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that many of the ice sheets in both the Arctic and Antarctic may be doomed to collapse. So that's it then? It's just been downhill since the 1700s? Guy Callender did report his findings in 1938, but the first real discussion on environmental issues was held in 1949 by the United Nations. It wasn't a major part of the UN, and it wasn't about climate change, but it was a step. Then, in 1968, the United Nations Economic and Social Council proposed the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. Held in June of 1972, the first Earth Summit, as the conference was called, was the first major conference that set out to preserve the Earth, and they even brought up climate change along with discussions of pollutants and other environmental issues. Most importantly, though, the summit established the United Nations Environment Program, Environment Fund, and the Environment Coordination Board. It wasn't until the late 70s and early 80s that UNEP would address climate in earnest with suggestions to monitor climate and reduce use of CFCs, the chemicals most responsible for the damage to the ozone layer. Another big moment came in 1988, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established, and work began in earnest with the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP. That work resulted in a few major steps around 1989, namely Resolution 44207, which began preparations to establish a, quote, framework convention on climate change, and the adoption and implementation, respectively, of the Helsinki Declaration to protect the ozone layer and the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. The second World Climate Conference was held in 1990, and 2 years later, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development was held in Brazil. This conference, which is also known as the Earth Summit, not to be confused with the first Earth Summit held in 1972, established a new framework to protect the Earth with the Rio Declaration and Agenda 21. It also saw the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, aka the UNFCCC, which is not at all a mouthful whatsoever. At time of recording... What? Recording? Don't worry about it too much, okay? At time of right now, 198 countries have signed the UNFCCC, which came into effect 2 years later in 1994. The UNFCCC... You know what? Never mind. The convention, according to itself, aims to prevent, quote, dangerous human interference with the climate system. Not long after, in 1995, the Berlin Mandate was adopted. Then the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol set a specific target to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gases, e.g. methane, by at least 5% from 2008 to 2012. After that, the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, which set targets to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius, And that's about it as far as the UN goes. Sure, there are a couple other ones, but those are the big ones. But the government's done something more than that, right? The US? Well, Nixon signed NEPA in 1970, which established the Council on Environmental Quality, and the EPA was formed later that year. The Clean Air Act in 1970 and the Clean Water Act and Ocean Dumping Act in 1972 certainly helped. Over the next couple of decades, more pollution-centered acts would be passed, as well as amendments. But action about global climate change didn't start till 1992, when they approved the convention, like we talked about earlier, as well as the Energy Policy Act to help growth of wind energy. After that, more of the same. Pollution and whatnot until 1997, when Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol. Clinton's administration also implemented better emission standards for cars in 1999. Unfortunately, this is where things start to go downhill. In 2001, George W. Bush declared that the U.S. wouldn't join the Kyoto Protocol after all. Of course, while Congress and the President were dilly-dallying, the EPA was still getting things done, like becoming the first federal agency to fully offset its electricity with green power, and establishing a rule to govern groundwater in addition to the other types that were already covered, both in 2006. Congress ultimately helped mandate the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program in 2001 and passed the American Clean Energy and Security Act in 2009. The first Obama administration also saw a number of fuel efficiency and emission standards passed for cars. In 2012, saw the passing of the Clean Energy Standards Act. In 2016, we saw the formation of the Climate Solutions Caucus and the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was later undone by President Donald Trump in 2017. The Trump administration also saw other backslides, like the removal of the Waters of the U.S. rule and the Clean Power Plan, both of which were Obama-era implementations. The Trump administration also moved to limit California's auto emission standards, which were more thorough than the rest of the country's. More thorough? Don't you mean fascistic and illegal? Come on, genius. What? Who are you? When did you get here? Don't worry about them. They show up sometimes, trying to deny what's good for the world in the name of profit. Narrator, babe, come on. We both know that profit's the name of the game. You're just being a woke moralist, trying to act like you're better than everybody else. No, I'm better than this. In 2021, on Biden's first day in office, the U.S. rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, and that's where our story ends for now. What? But I thought they just passed something that was supposed to be huge for the climate. Why aren't we talking about that? Oh, just you wait. We'll get there. You can be sure of that. I just need to convince you first. What? Convince me? What do you mean? The simple answer is, you don't need to. There's nothing to worry about. Now hold on a second. I'll deal with you later. Ultimately, there are a few reasons why you should care about climate change. The biggest of which is, it's your home, and like I said in the intro, what? Shush, you. Like I said in the stinger, the world's on fire. Rivers are draining worldwide right now due, according to Dave Swain, a UCLA climatologist, largely to climate change, which has meant that the mountain snow reservoirs that fuel the headwaters of major rivers like the Yangtze and the Rhine, rivers that feed millions of people in Asia and Europe respectively, have been drier than ever thanks to global rising temperatures. Of course, this global warming hokey all over again. It's not real, you know. Just look at the Sargasso Sea study. Well, force my hand, why don't you? The famous Sargasso Sea study, which ExxonMobil used for the, quote, unsettled science ad campaign in the early 2000s, isn't representative of global climate change like ExxonMobil claimed. The study's author said as much after the ads came out, and even said, quote, the sad thing is that a company with the resources of ExxonMobil is exploiting the data for political purposes. In fact, this isn't the first nor the last time that ExxonMobil or the oil and natural gas industry as a whole tried to downplay or deny climate change. despite knowing what was happening and that it was their fault.
Now, hold on. You don't need...
Actually, I do need to. Exxon's predecessor, Humble Oil, knew about the effects of fossil fuels and their carbon dioxide emissions all the way back in 1957 and continued to know. The oil industry as a whole knew too, as by the early 80s, minutes from a meeting of most major fossil fuel corporations, including Exxon, Mobil, Phillips, Shell, and Sunoco, indicate that not only did these companies know that climate change was happening, they knew that they had a responsibility to manage it. Right after that, though, in 1983, even with an annual profit of $5 billion, Exxon slashed their climate research budget down from almost $1 million a year to only $150,000. By 1989, they had helped form the Global Climate Coalition, a think tank devoted to opposing climate regulations that would harm their profits. In 1995, the GCC warned their members that they couldn't deny carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases had a significant effect on the climate, and that humans were doing it. Nevertheless, Exxon CEO Lee Raymond stated in speeches that it was inconclusive at best that humans were causing climate change, and in 1997 that the climate wasn't changing at all, and even if it wasn't the fault of fossil fuels. Several more times in the 90s, Exxon and their fellows funded papers denying the scientific consensus, leading up to their 2001 funding of George Bush's inauguration and the US's subsequent withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol. Despite being told to stop funding climate denialism, ExxonMobil was found to have given over $30 million to help fund corporations and organizations that peddled those very same ideas. But I digress. I think I was talking about rivers.
Sure, let's go with that.
Right. Well, those rivers drying up is due, at least in large part, to the warming of the atmosphere. And it puts millions of people in danger, like the 40 million people in the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico that rely on the Colorado River, another river that is drying up thanks to Prophet Boy's friends. Add to that the 84 million people reliant on the Yangtze, not to mention the Rhine, Po, Loire, and Danube in Europe, and you have hundreds of millions of people at risk of running out of the water that they need for food, power, and water. Add to that heat waves like the one that swept through Europe in July of 2022, which set records for heat and drought across the west of Europe, and you have a mixture with only one outcome: death. If you are an empathetic person at all, you need to care, because millions of lives are on the line.
All right. So maybe Exxon doesn't have a great track record with this kind of stuff, and a bunch of people might die. But you don't know that it's all human-caused. It could just be a natural warming period. Those happen all the time.
Right. Well, you aren't all wrong. The Earth does naturally go through cycles influenced by a lot of things, notably the sun's energy. But despite the fact that the EPA's graph of sun energy looks like this, the graph of overall surface temperature looks like this.
Then it's a natural increase in carbon dioxide. Those happen too.
Again, yes, but I mean, just look at it. The spike is massive. We should be below 300 parts per million right now, not over 400. This is undoubtedly our fault, and it's shown over and over again. Graph after graph, there are massive spikes right after the Industrial Revolution and only accelerating over time. Look, concentration of CO2 or methane or nitrous oxide, they're all higher than ever. It's our fault and we need to deal with it, because it's not just rivers that are at threat. The entire ecosystem is. And we keep setting records for the hottest year ever. 2020 and 2016 are tied right now. The ice caps and glaciers are melting, snow cover at the poles is decreasing, and the Arctic sea ice is rapidly vanishing. All that means that the habitats of polar animals like penguins, polar bears, and Arctic foxes are rapidly disappearing as the ice they stand on vanishes while the sea levels rise. And theirs aren't the only climates changing, as rainfall patterns shift worldwide, resulting in more rain at higher altitudes and less at lower ones. Add on to that a warmer ocean with more heat waves, higher acidity, and lower oxygen levels, And whether they live on land or sea, equator or pole, chances are that the animals you love most are running out of places to live and are dying in the process. So if you like animals, no matter what you do, you should care.
Oh, boo-hoo, the animals are dying, and it's very depressing. But come on, I mean, it's so depressing. I mean, I can barely muster myself to do anything about this. What do you expect the poor bystanders to do?
Well, yeah, I guess. What hope is there? Why should I care if it's all doomed? That's just the wonderful thing, though, is that we aren't doomed. Sure, we can't meet the necessary goals for sustainability right now, but we can conserve nature and meet global needs if we make changes. If we make the right changes soon enough, we may even be able to restore some of the problems that we have right now, getting us back to a better place. It won't be easy, and the people who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo will push back through disinformation and defeatism, but we can make it through.
In August of 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which, at time of recording, is the biggest piece of climate legislation the US has ever passed. It gets a lot of things right at the end of the day, like investment in green energy, funding for sustainable consumer programs, and environmental justice initiatives. But it's definitely not perfect. For instance, it doesn't focus enough on preparing for climate disasters that are already happening and will only continue to happen more and more often. It also ties offshore wind energy to oil and natural gas production, ensuring that fossil fuel companies like Exxon continue to expand their operations when they really should be scaled down. It also doesn't go far enough to meet the US's goals and will likely come with challenges to implementation at the state and local level. Those goals are key, too, as the IPCC stressed the need for the world to hit net zero CO2 as soon as possible last year, and the US lost a lot of time while out of the Paris Accords. It's also critical that the US improve climate literacy to combat denialism and misinformation. The problem is, even though the IRA hits a lot of the IPCC's suggestions fairly well, like reducing emissions and taking a somewhat longer-term perspective, and helping to address climate in a more equitable way, it's not okay for the US or Europe to act alone, especially not anymore. The whole world needs to be taking coordinated steps to reduce emissions, prepare everyone, especially low-income and other vulnerable communities, for severe weather events, and combat information. A lot of fixing this problem is going to come down to working together.
Your plan is to work together? That's it? The power of friendship? I love you moralist types. You're so predictable.
You know, this is a great time for another lesson. Do you want to learn something, bystander?
Sure.
Let's learn about climate denialism, shall we? Very few people actually deny that climate change is happening, between 5 and 8%. But there is a huge consensus gap, as the Australian Psychological Society calls it. While in reality, more than 97% of scientists agree that climate change is happening, and it is, at least largely, humanity's fault, the public perception is usually closer to 50%. In other words, the public thinks that climate change is more debated than it is. The small population of climate deniers and corporations like Exxon who benefit from climate change policy not being introduced are able to produce enough misinformation and doubt to throw off our perception, leading to the common belief that the consensus is out. It isn't.
Look, it's our freedom of speech, all right? We can say whatever we want. And there are scientists that agree with us too. They deserve to be heard out.
Ah, yes. Hearing out both sides, how could I forget? The fact is, taking the centrist position on this argument is arguably as dangerous as being a climate denier is. There is no debate. As Dr. Michael Mann says, quote, anyone who adheres to the notion that climate change is a hoax or that it isn't caused by us or even that it's not creating problems is already on the wrong side of science and the wrong side of history. Platforming climate denialism just ends up feeding the consensus gap and spreading faulty ideas. Climate change isn't a debate, just like trans rights, gay marriage, or women's suffrage. There's only one side, and it's non-negotiable.
But haven't you been platforming the Exxon guy by debunking his ideas? Doesn't that go against what you just said?
Kinda, yeah. But it's also important to debunk these ideas. That way, when somebody neutral, like you, comes along and sees them, they know they aren't true. The real problem comes when you portray both sides of the argument as valid when they just aren't.
So anyone denying climate change is just lying. They're trying to get rich quick and stop regulations, like the Exxon guy.
No, a lot of people are just scared. Climate change is terrifying, and when push comes to shove, most people would rather pretend that there isn't a problem than acknowledge that there is an existential threat looming at all times. It's a valid response at first, but it gets in the way of fixing the problem if you deny for too long. The problem is people like the capitalist feed into people's fears and give them more reasons to doubt. Plus, people have confirmation bias, and we always look for more reasons to keep believing what we do rather than things that disagree with us. That's what really makes platforming denialism bad. It gives vulnerable people scared about this looming terror more reasons to keep denying. They'll walk away from a debate agreeing with whoever they first agreed with, but they might walk away from a takedown less convinced.
So we should just counter all their points when we hear them. Give them an absolute debate bro takedown.
Not always, and usually no. Countering points is helpful for people who are undecided or just apathetic, but it will make somebody who's denying climate change defensive. They don't want to be made a fool, they want to believe that they're smart. And you are threatening that. Instead, do what the BBC suggests. Affirm their worldview, remain humble, and start conversations, not debates.
What do you mean affirm their worldview? I thought that's what we were trying to change. And remain humble? What's that about?
Well, I mean that you need to engage with people on their level, with what they care about. If somebody's religious, talk about God's creation. If they're proud and highly rational, help feed them pieces so they can feel like they figured it out instead of being told. If you can get to what people care about and interact with them as a human, you'll be more effective. That's what being humble's about too. It's about engaging with someone as an equal, not as a holier-than-thou debate bro ready to slam dunk their point into the ground. It may be fun to own the libs or whatever they're talking about these days, but it's not productive. You just end up with more animosity. Instead, have an open conversation, introduce topics, and don't expect to change their mind in a day. It may feel like it's not working or that you're wasting time, but remember, changing hearts and minds is a slow process.
I think I get it, but I'm confused. Haven't you been doing all the stuff you just told me not to do? Is the capitalist really that far gone that it doesn't matter?
Well, I suppose I hadn't thought about it like that. I guess they aren't, but I think I know how to fix that. At least a bit.
But how do you do that? What are you going to tell them?
Feel the weight of the world weighing heavy on my mind. Feel the weight of the world weighing heavy on my mind. Feel the weight of the world weighing heavy on my mind. Feel the weight of the world weighing heavy on my mind.
So you're finally going to convince me, huh? Get me to abandon my rational ways and jump into the liberal pit of weekly outrage? I'd like to see you try. I would.
Before I do, can I ask you a question?
My permission hasn't stopped you before.
Are you religious?
What? I didn't think you were into that sort of thing.
It's just a question. You don't have to answer if you don't want to.
As it happens, yes I am. Irish Catholic, not practicing.
Are you familiar with St. Francis of Assisi? He's a favorite of the popes, as I recall.
Yes, I know him.
Are you familiar with Laudato Si, mi signore?
What are you doing?
Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. The Pope quoted it. I'm sure you've heard it.
I don't see where you're going with this. It's not like you to quote the saints at me.
You, as a Catholic, believe in the sanctity of God's creation, yes? That what God created is holy and beautiful?
Yeah, I suppose, but I already said I'm not practicing. What do you want from me? Bible quotes?
I just want you to listen. And remember that this world is your God's creation. If, as you say you do, you believe in its sanctity, why would you let harm come to it? Why not preserve and cherish it?
Look, you're just trying to catch me in a trap. You don't even believe in God. Why are you quoting the saints to try and get me to believe in a problem that doesn't exist?
Sure, I don't believe in God, but the threat does exist. You've seen the data.
And I don't trust it, as we've established.
Can I paint a picture for you? A mental one of what will happen if we don't stop now and fix what we've done.
Oh, be my guest, Dreamweaver. Spin me up a tale of doom and gloom. That'll convince me.
Well, temperatures will continue to rise, threatening animal life, plant life, and human life. The IPCC predicts that we'll hit 1.5 degrees Celsius of net warming in the next 2 decades, which will lead to more heat waves and shorter winters. At 2 degrees, which we're likely to hit if we keep going, those heat waves will intensify, reaching critical points for the health of our food and ourselves. In other words, famine. People will starve and die in heat waves. The IPCC also reports that we'll experience more intense droughts and, when we get rain, more intense flooding. The sea levels will rise, forcing people to move, amplifying any ongoing refugee crises. The coasts will erode, and concerningly, the IPCC predicts that extreme sea level events that used to happen centuries apart will happen years apart and eventually yearly. But here's the thing. Not every part of the world will get the heat increase the same. So, while some parts of the world will get much less than 2 degrees of increase, other parts will get much, much more. Even if you live somewhere cold, by the way, you're not off the hook. Your winters will be shorter, yes, but storms will be worse. Precipitation includes blizzards. So when I say that precipitation increases at higher latitudes, I mean that once-in-a-lifetime blizzards are going to become once in a decade, then once in a year, and maybe more.
All that is supposed to scare me, I guess?
No, I don't want to scare you. I'm just telling the truth.
What I know is that I got a family to feed, and investors to keep happy, and employees to take care of. I don't need this apocalyptic bullcrap. I got real problems to deal with.
I believe you. And I'm sure it's a lot of work. But, if I may, suppose that it is real. Like the scientists say, and suppose they're right. And somehow you're wrong. What then? Who do you sell gas to when they're all gone?
But the big red bird that lives